Nice to see you, sir.
Great to be here.
I want to ask you about a quote I read of yours, which is this: "Look at Africa a new way, through the windshield and not the rearview mirror, as a continent of promise and opportunity, not problems."
Absolutely.
Explain that.
When I say the word Africa, most parts of the United States, the connotation and the thought that comes up immediately is that that's the continent where problems come from. You know, the four horsemen of the apocalypse, pestilence and drought and famine and things like that. The true story of Africa, especially right now, is totally different than that. Sure, the continent still has its problems, but every continent has its problems. The positive news is a lot more than it ever has been before, and I think it's very important for Americans to also see that, because other people are definitely seeing that. You know, the Europeans, the Chinese, other countries in Asia, they look at Africa as an opportunity and not as a problem. And I would like to try and change that narrative with the United States as well.
Is there a way to define the Trump strategy towards Africa, and is it profoundly different from that of the Obama administration or the Bush administration before that?
The good news is that there will be a strategy coming out, for a formal strategy for the administration in the very near future. So I'm not going to, get into the specifics of that. Historically, for the 60 years that we've had formal relations with the newly emerging African countries, strategies have changed in wording, but not that much in actual content. The United States-Africa strategy has always been twofold. One was kind of a long-term, where do we want to go? But there was always a short-term series of crises, which always overwhelmed the long-term. So the strategy has traditionally been stable Africa, end the wars, end human suffering, do as much as possible towards both human and economic development. And administrations, use different language, but the intents were always pretty well the same.
Which I guess is more of the looking through the rearview mirror in the sense of dealing with the problems. So even though you said you're not going to tell me what the strategy is, can you give me a tip, or can the people of Africa, this broadcast all over Africa?
Absolutely. I will tell you, let me tell you why I came back to this job, because it has a lot to do with that. Africa has a huge force that's getting ready to wash over it. Like it or not, the population's going to double between now and 2050. And that huge influx of people is going to be all young people. They're going to have exactly the same dreams as young people everywhere do because of modern technology. And those young people are going to want, more than anything else, jobs, jobs, jobs. So these governments have a choice, because there's going to be two possible routes. One is going to be extremely negative, because if there's no opportunities, no jobs, those young people are going to turn more and more towards migration and maybe even destabilization and potential for terrorism. If there are jobs, Africa could be one of the largest forces in history for dynamic economic growth.
So I guess that's the sort of the hint, is that the Trump administration strategy is how do we get more jobs into Africa?
Because, absolutely, because getting more jobs into Africa really is about the governments putting in place an environment that will attract foreign investment. Because we all know that the way countries develop is through foreign investment. There's not enough development assistance in the world to get to that point. I mean, if you look at other models, especially recently, China didn't even have a development agency when it went through that miracle economic growth, during those decades. Africa, to grow, to develop, to become middle income, or as aid administrator Mark Green said, the journey to self-reliance really requires very quick economic growth, which requires jobs, which requires foreign direct investment, which requires the business people from around the world wanting to find an environment where they feel comfortable investing. And that is the challenge for for African governments.
Well, how do you get the African governments to want us, meaning the United States, to be sort of the ones that partners in economic development, if we say, look, we want accountability, and we want, so you can have self-reliance, and maybe another nation like China says, here, you got two choices. We'll either lend you the money or we'll give you free money, no strings attached, not knowing that even the lending has strings down the road when the debt comes due. But so how do you convince these African nations that, deal with us, don't deal with China?
Here's the good news. African governments really, really want the United States businesses to come over there. I was recently at the United Nations General Assembly, and around the UN meetings, we had a number of peripheral events and had a number of heads of state meet with U.S. business delegations. Their message was the same. We want American businesses to come because American businesses tend to create a lot of jobs. With some other countries that are heavily involved in Africa, just about anybody above the level of turning a shovel is going to be coming directly from that other country. So they may be large projects, but they often don't have a lot of jobs. Whereas American businesses have a reputation for bringing jobs, for transferring technology, for transferring the know-how, the savvy, the management that the African governments really, really want. So this is more a factor of us doing what the host governments and especially what the host people want from us.
I imagine, though, that some of the considerations that I use the term Africa, but there are many nations, there are very different histories and very different issues.
Absolutely.
But many of the nations, they've had recent civil war. It's not like our civil war that goes back over 100 years, but they've had civil war very recently, this generation, or may even be in the midst of a civil war. So what's the incentive for an American company to go invest in some of these African nations which don't appear particularly stable from afar?
Well, here's the good news. Some countries which were unstable not even that long ago, or were not attractive environments for, say, a non-frontier type of business development, they have changed remarkably. I mean, right now in Africa, around the continent, you have some tremendous positive news stories coming out. Look at the incredible changes that have happened in Ethiopia with Prime Minister Abiy just literally over several months, where he has made dramatic changes to the extent of opening up political space, opening up economic space, to where American investors and others are literally lining up wanting to get in there. You have something similar happening on the other end of the continent in Angola, where you have a president, again, I think this shows you the difference true leadership makes, that has put in changes which have the business community lining up. Others are saying they want to make those changes. Of course, you know, we'll have to wait and see. For example, this week I had a very nice conversation with a business delegation coming from Zimbabwe, of all places, because the president of Zimbabwe says that he wants to do a total course correction from where Zimbabwe has been going. We'll wait and see if that happens. But if it does, again, the business people and the business community will be lining up to get in there. So you're having this, I don't want to call it an outbreak of good news, but in fact that's what it is. You have positive developments happening around the continent. And of course you still have the problems in certain areas. But I believe that they're going to get fewer and fewer, and there's a lot of attention, a lot of energy paid towards helping resolve them.
We have some nations like Sudan with President Bashir. He's been in power since 1989. He's under indictment for genocide at the ICC. I don't think he's going any place soon, although he says he's not going to run for re-election, but he continues to do so, and he continues to win. Then you've got Salva Kiir in South Sudan, and
yes.
where all the oil is. And
Yes.
China has provided a lot of the technology to get that oil, so China's deep in there. And you've got South Sudan in a civil war. You've had civil war in the Darfur region and Nuba Mountain of Sudan. So how can a business be, and Sudan's still a state sponsor of terrorism from the State Department.
For the time being.
So
right?
do we sort of carve those two countries out and look at development in some of the more receptive areas, or do we dig into those?
Not necessarily, because even with those countries, and you mentioned one I think that is causing myself and so many Americans more heartbreak than anyone else, and that's the case of South Sudan. No, what we do there is stay very much engaged and tell them you know, what we would like to see happen, because unfortunately the country you mentioned, China, tends to do business and doesn't bring up any of these inconvenient truths about human rights and lack of political space and lack of any kind of democratic transition. But we do stay engaged, and we talk to them, and we'll see if there is a change in the course that they're following. And the same, I mean, we you know, if we want to talk about the problems, of course, again, just like the good news, we can talk about elections coming up in Democratic Republic of the Congo, the horrors that are going on in Cameroon, you know, which is another absolute tragedy, because in many respects it's absolutely needless, and on. But you know, you have engagement in the areas which need to improve, and you have a different type of engagement in the areas which are ready to attract business to move forward into the 21st century.
You mentioned DRC. They've had some outbreak. I think it's DRC recently, of Ebola.
Right.
And that's bad news, of course, for those. But it's sort of interesting how in Liberia and Ghana and Sierra Leone, I think that the outbreak was so horrendous.
Sierra Leone, right.
Was so horrendous. Yet with American help and Doctors Without Borders and others, is actually the world was able to somewhat contain that.
Absolutely. Where the Ebola is happening right now is a very, very unfortunate set of circumstances, starting with where it is happening, because it is in part of DRC where it's politically highly unstable. There are a number of violent groups operating there, so there is a real question of access to be able to do the contact tracing, to follow, and treat whoever might have come into contact with it. So that is a very serious problem there. And also, of course, that borders on both Uganda and Rwanda. The good news about Rwanda and Uganda is that if there's, by chance, crossing the border, those countries have access to 100% of their territory. And of course, we would be prepared to work with them. So hopefully, we'll keep our fingers crossed and that the international response to the Ebola there will work. Unfortunately, because of the access, there's going to be a certain amount of human suffering, which is needless if the situation was different.
A lot of people in Africa want to come to the United States. I understand why. Immigration is sometimes quite a hurdle. You've got people on work permits, student permits, or join their families here in the United States. And of course, the Trump administration has raised barriers to a lot of Muslim-dominating countries. What's the message to Africa about getting visas to the United States for work, for study?
Well, the fact is, since I was on the other side of that equation not long ago when I was working at Texas Tech University, and U.S. universities love to have students from Africa. For example, at Texas Tech, the group with the second highest grade point average were Nigerian students. So U.S. universities are very eager to get African students.
Can they get the visas?
Absolutely. Absolutely they can get the visas. The situation is that we take a very close look at every single visa applicant. We do, our embassies have recruiting trips for U.S. universities to come across. Africa, I think, for U.S. universities is right now the hottest potential market, because you have in so many countries a very quick expansion of middle income and higher income people. And, we have the best university system in the world. Africans, again, like Indians, Chinese, and Europeans, want to send their kids to the very best universities.
Is there a risk, though, I imagine in Africa worries about a brain drain. They come here to the U.S. Universities and colleges,
yes.
And are they going to come back to Africa and help Africa?
A brilliant question. I remember when I was ambassador in Ethiopia, there were more Ethiopian doctors in Chicago than in Addis Ababa, which was the capital. So that is a very, very keen issue. But here's the thing. At the end of the day, most people want to stay in their home country. They leave for a variety of reasons. Most of those are push factors. And of course, there are also some pull factors. If the African governments put in place the type of environments which do attract direct investment, which create more employment, then you're going to have the situation of more and more people. They may come to the States to get the education. Again, we have the best universities, but then they have an opportunity and a reason to go back to their home countries and contribute. I'm with you. I do not like the brain drain, because Africa desperately needs those college graduates. But it's up to those governments, again, to put in a type of environment which will say to their highly educated college graduates, come on back, because there's equal opportunity for you here.
First Lady Melania Trump went to 5 African nations recently. Do you feel the impact of that? I mean, are the people receptive, and does it change anything? I mean, we're always proud when the First Ladies, whatever First Lady travels, but are those goodwill tours effective?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The response from each of the places where she visited was overwhelmingly positive, very warmly welcomed. The Africans really, really appreciate seeing that that warm human contact. So yes, very, very positive. Those types of trips definitely show the United States at its best.
All right, well, all the African nations that watch are going to be looking for those jobs that you tipped off that the U.S. is going to be, we're going to bring over there, so we'll be watching.
Well, I certainly hope it happens. And remember, Africa through the windshield, not the rearview mirror.
Indeed. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.